Today, I'm talking to SolarPower Europe CEO James Watson as part of our series investigating the prospects of each technology within the power generation sector and the prospects of that sector and the advantages and disadvantages of the technology and where it's going to be over the coming decades and beyond. So James, how are you doing this morning?
Yeah, really great. Thanks, Diarmaid. And thanks for inviting me onto your series. Looking forward to sharing some of the insights from our industry with you and the people who are following you.
That's great. I mean, so far we've spoken to people from nuclear, coal, and wind, and so it's good to get around to solar, which a lot of people, are very positive about. And if you're to pick up any of the textbooks on, general assessments of where we are in terms of power generation in the world, solar always comes out pretty well. I mean, there are like little issues or big issues that need to be resolved, and maybe you want to be further down the road than you are. But I mean, one of the first things I'd like to talk about is maybe, I mean, you can, if you'd like, you can take the conversation in a different direction. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was maybe the grids. I mean, how important is it for, I mean, obviously each region is different. So in Africa, you have a lot of diesel gensets and things like that, in a country with so much solar potential seems a crime. Whereas in Europe, then we have other problems, and we're trying to get our grid more developed to adapt to the needs of solar. How important is it for the industry that the grids can cope with the challenge of solar and other renewable energies? And how confident are you that this can be developed and not derail the potential of the technology?
Well, I think that's a really good question to start with. And if I'll start from the top, if you like, and just say, imagine the electricity system in Europe, and let's start with Europe rather than the world. Maybe 10 years ago, you had thousands of power generating plants, coal plants, gas plants, a few wind farms, this sort of thing. And today, we're already looking at a situation where we have about 3.5 million PV systems that have been put into place in Europe. So if you imagine that we're now talking about millions of systems that are being used to generate electricity across Europe, it's a totally different scene to what you had 10 years ago. Then the question is whether or not the grid has been built to actually deal with what is a lot of decentralization of power generation. So, for example, what I mean is, Diarmaid, you and I can have a system on our house and we can generate electricity and we can put it into the grid, or we can take back from the grid if we're not making enough. And that didn't exist 10 years ago. So in a way, there's been an enormous rapid evolution in the way that we are generating power in Europe. We saw that we've seen about 90 gigawatts of power being produced by solar power in Europe last year. So in that respect, it's been a rapid growth from almost 0 10 years ago to 90 today. What we're talking about is essentially a whole new system that needs to somehow be accommodated into an older system. The grids were built when it was a centralized system. So everything was built to go from power plants to where that power was needed, to the industrial sectors, to the cities. And now the cities have the possibilities of generating their own electricity. So yes, first and foremost, we are indeed very interested in the way the grid will have to deal with this new challenge, but we are certainly in no way anti the grid. What we think you need is an improved, smarter grid and probably an extended grid, because you're going to have more and more different decentralized providers of power rather than more and more centralized providers. I think you're seeing over the last 20 years quite a lot of decommissioning of nuclear, of coal. And so in replacing of that, you're getting many more renewables, which are decentralized by nature. So it is a challenge for the grid, but we think here that it is possible for the grids to be able to actually cope with the change that is taking place. And if I may, before you go on with the next question, we had a kind of stress test of the ability of the grids in March with the solar eclipse. And basically everything went entirely fine, even in countries where we've seen, like Germany, where they can get 50% of their power on a sunny day from PV. That basically, even with that level of penetration, an event like losing the sun for 20 minutes in the middle of the day actually had no impact on the power provision to that country. And that's a very large industrial country as well.
Okay. I mean, as you say, over the last decade, it's just absolutely accelerated. I mean, solar has been around for a lot longer than a decade, but I mean, why has it suddenly found its feet? Is it because policymakers and the technologies have obviously improved, but what's driving that? Is it just suddenly, how come the field has suddenly opened up?
Right. I mean, it's a really good point. And I would say it's two things. One is the policy environment. And so with the decision to do something like the renewables targets at the European level and introducing the incentives and support schemes that you've had in Europe, you've seen the possibility for people to invest and get the deployment going. The second is the tremendous amount of cost reduction in a system cost. So if, say, 7 years ago, you were paying around about 15,000 as an individual for your PV system, that can be as low as 5,000 today, and even lower in some countries. And what the IEA have said is that basically the cost of systems have come down by about 60 to 70%. So what we have done is been able to take advantage of the policy environment, which is an enabling framework, and then we've been able to introduce alongside that huge cost reduction. So the two things being married really have been able to drive this. A lot of people, I say revolution. I think of it's much more of a very quick change. It's a transition, and really solar has been a major benefactor of that. To come back to your very first point, we're a pretty popular type of technology. We don't face the problems that other technologies do. And I read recently that in the UK, the DEC there, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, had done a recent survey and found that 75% of people in the UK supported the deployment of solar power. I mean, the next highest was something like wind at about 50. So we really are neck and shoulders above other technologies in terms of public acceptance.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that issue of cost reduction, it's linked with efficiency. I mean, I've just noticed just from researching it that, it seems to be almost daily, there's frequent stories, really innovations that are making solar panels more efficient. Are there any particular new progressions worth getting excited about? I know that cost reduction and that efficiency is linked in terms of, you're showing how much value can be got from just these little incremental increases in the ability of our technology to harness that huge resource. How quickly is the sector making the progress it requires to justify investment and, eventually overtake fossils in every department?
Well, I think we're doing quite well. And to be honest, yes, we do get some questions about the efficiency of panels, and they are improving all the time. Again, it's an ongoing system that we see in terms of the research and development, the money that's being put into the panels to completely improve their efficiency. And it really is happening on a year-to-year basis. So it is pretty fast. And for example, in Europe recently, one of our large manufacturers was able to demonstrate that they were getting efficiency in the rates, in the mid-20s. That was approved by Fraunhofer, saying, this is the truth. I mean, what that does, that means that you could produce more power with the same materials or even less materials. For example, you can reduce the thickness of glass. You can make the glass more efficient that's on top of the panels. And so ultimately, what we are seeing is a lot of technology that is being driven through research and development financing, working with universities and technology institutes to make our technology better and better. And that actually does mean that the price can come down because you need less materials. And on the other side, you're creating more efficient output, which means you're getting more bang for your buck, I was going to say, but it means you get more electricity for the money you're putting in there. So that's a very important thing. And indeed, a lot of companies are devoted to what I also consider this is a sort of quality issue, making sure that the panels are of the highest quality, they have a good lifetime, that they don't use too much resources, and that they are very efficient. At the very beginning of our journey, to the sort of maturity we have today, 10 years ago, a lot of people were saying, solar panels are great, but how much carbon dioxide is actually used in their production? What's the footprint like, et cetera, et cetera. And we can honestly say that within 2 years of use, you've already paid back the overall cost of the system, and they last for 25, even up to 30 if you buy a good quality system.
Yeah.
30 years. From my perspective, yes, this is important. We do invest in it as an industry, and we will continue to do so. What we want to avoid is coming across as a kind of unreliable technology, and that means that that would damage your reputation. And so we're desperately trying to make sure that people understand we are committed to making them better and better.
I mean, there seems to be such a proliferation of little incremental improvements from various countries around the world. I mean, does does the overall, say, governing bodies involved in solar, do they find it difficult to, I suppose, aggregate all that together so that you can maybe look 5 years ago, 2 years ago, and now and see, you can actually pinpoint this is how much a particular solar panel, how efficient it is compared to where it was a few years ago. And is there like projections being made by institutes such as Fraunhofer, whereby they can tell you, well, this is where we are now and this is where we will be in another 10 years?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, it's a technology that's actually very easy as well to have your hands on because you actually create it. And in a way, many of the other technologies are kind of, you're extracting things and you've got to make estimates of what's down there. Really, with solar, you can actually get a hold of the panel and you can say, okay, this is what it's made of, and this is what we can do to try and improve its performance. It's a very different thing. We always like to think of it as, rather than extracting, we're manufacturing power, because
Right.
that's actually what we're doing. You're taking the sun's natural energy and you manufacture electricity from it through the product that we have, like panels. And yeah, to come back to your point, yeah, in terms of the governing bodies, in fact, the European Commission and others, so IRENA, the International Energy Agency, IEA, we work together with them on a lot of different projects, and we can look at the evolution of efficiency and even make projections for it. And some of the projects that we're involved with the IEA and with the European Commission, so two different projects, we are able to show that we'll be able to get into the high 20s in terms of efficiency within the next few years. So that's actually another massive improvement, because you're also talking about a 50% improvement almost. Maybe I'm overstating it and being a bit too primal, but say even 30% is a very good increase in efficiency, which will translate into better power production. So yes, it is a very important thing to do, to put in the effort into this. And indeed, in my team here, we have 2 researchers who are dedicated to it, who work with people like Fraunhofer, European Commission, International Energy Agency, but also the companies. So that's the beauty of it. It's working together with business and the governing bodies to understand what is the potential and where we can go. And that's why you actually then see the projections that we also do and that other organizations do of how solar power will grow in terms of its importance in the global power supply, because we can actually estimate and know roughly what the efficiency increase will be, the cost reduction will be, and we'll be able to say, okay, given this, we're pretty sure that we'll be able to get to X level by this time. So yeah, we're saying that, you can imagine something like 400 gigawatts by 2020 globally. So from our point of view, given what we know about the technology, given that it's not based on as I say, needing to sort of have the geological extraction, trying to work out what's down there and what might not be down there. Because I tell you, and I've got nothing against fossil fuel industry at all, but I've always liked it because we've always had this discussion about peak oil and people saying oil fields are running out, yet they never seem to, because they're able to improve their technology and then they find more. It's not that difficult for us. We know what the technology is like and we know where we can make the efficiencies. So in essence, nobody ever starts talking. I don't think it's going to start talking about peak solar. Well, not for a long time yet. Probably centuries from now, Diarmaid.
That 400 gigawatt figure there. What is it currently? What's the global solar?
180 globally.
180. Okay, but then again, as you say, basically at the start of this conversation, the fact that it's accelerated so much off a fairly small base. I know for some people 10 years is a long time, or 20 years or 30 years, but really if that's the extent of progress that quickly, you would think that if that level of progress can be maintained, that it's going to be fantastic in 30 years or 40 years.
Well, I just interrupt you for a second and just say the International Energy Agency have said that by 2050, undoubtedly solar will be the largest the biggest power producer in the world. For them, there's no doubt about that. The only question is what else is in the mix that's alongside it. So I think, for even beyond the projections we make, if you like, the independent bodies are looking at this and saying, yeah, by 2030, you'll have a huge amount of solar in the system, potentially up to 16% in Europe. Those are IEA figures again. It's seen by so many different independent bodies as the main future source of energy, of creating electricity. And I think that we're also helped not just by those type of people, but also the kind of Elon Musks of this world who do look around and say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. How am I going to make my money in the future? I know I'm going to invent the solar car, if you like.
Yeah.
And my view is that we have this good kind of ability to be able to demonstrate that we know that we're going to be cheaper and more efficient, which lets big organizations like the IEA make their estimations and say, okay, given what we know about all the other energy sources, costs associated, how they're able to actually be produced and generate power, they're putting solar at the top by, hopefully still in our lifetimes, Diarmaid. I'm just working that out. Yeah, should be in my 70s. So by 2050.
Yeah. Very good. Child prodigy.
Yeah. Elon Musk certainly was.
Yeah. Well, it's very good to have personalities like that driving it, because
exactly right.
I wouldn't say there is resistance from the other technologies, but there's an understandable defensiveness, to maintain, wealth and, power and influence, no matter what technology you're in. I suppose when you speak about that sort of, progress, and the fact that there are influential people involved in behind the scenes that are very, the publicity is there as well. I mean, funding seems to be something that often it's hard for renewable energies. Well, I suppose it depends on the part of the world you're in, but generally speaking, I mean, how difficult is it for the industry to secure private investment globally? I mean, when you think of making solar power a true contender, and we still have fossil fuels, are still, I suppose, predominant to a point in maintaining our industries and keeping our societies going. But slowly, your renewable technologies are getting there. I'm just thinking, I mean, do you think that when you see the likes of EIB or the World Bank, or other financial institutions, and they're diverting their funding away from coal, for example, in developing countries, I mean, is that money finding its way to more renewable technologies? And just how important is it for to secure that private investment? And how is it a challenge that you still have and will continue to have for a long time?
Yeah.
Sorry about the really long question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, I got it. The main point being how easy is it for us to secure private financing? And the question is perfectly right, Diarmaid, because as I mentioned, a lot of the kickstart at the beginning was to do with getting the support schemes, the incentives that were put in place by governments, policymakers, etc. In Europe, we've seen they're going into decline everywhere. And that means that if you're in a situation where there isn't a lot of public money and public financing available, you've got to replace it with private. And that's certainly a major concern for us, because to get private investors in, you need to be able to show that you have a stable sector. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the different countries, the different rules, but if you look at places like Spain or Bulgaria in Europe, we can go global shortly, but if you look at those kind of countries, they've had their sort of explosion of solar because of the policies that put in place. And then the governments have panicked a little bit and then have said, okay, well, we need to stop that because it's costing us a lot of money. And then put in place a lot of retroactive measures, which are very, very destabilizing. And then a private investor looks at that and he's thinking, well, hang on, there was a lot of good times. Well, there's about a year of good times. And now there's a sort of moratorium on support, and people who are using their own solar systems are having their rights infringed, not necessarily being able to do anything other than pass the power through to the grid and not seeing the value of the money for themselves. Investors say, oh, that's not exactly what we want. So what we've been doing, and again, it's in conjunction with a lot of the big regulatory bodies like the European Commission, like the International Energy Agency, is to try and identify what we call no regrets models that can be put in place for PV financing. So we've been working heavily on trying to find the models that would be the most suitable for investors. Because in the end, there is a huge possibility for big investors to get involved in solar. So much depends on the regulatory environment. For example, in Germany, you've still got big pension funds, you've got big investors plowing into solar parks because they know the investment environment is pretty stable there. Where it's unstable, then yes, it's pretty difficult. So we're trying to pull together all the best practice. And once we've got that best practice, we can start speaking to governments, start speaking to regulators, saying these are the best ways of actually creating the right investment environment to drive the private investments into solar, into other renewables, actually. And I would just go back to one point that I'd read recently in an outlet. I think it was The Economist, and it was saying there's about 40 billion in green funds last year, and that means green funds, which doesn't really have a definition, but essentially looking at renewables, and that could be up to something like 400 billion in a couple of years' time. That means there's money there and there is interest. It's a question about being able to find it and direct it to the projects that need it. And so at the moment, that's our biggest challenge. And you'll have seen the actual rate of deployment of solar in Europe has gone down since 2011, year on year. And a lot of that is being basically driven by the difficulty of finding the private investment to replace the public financing. So given the challenge that we have, we can be very optimistic about what the future is and say that we know what the projections are. But the next few years will be quite a battle for us. Though we expect, given, as I said, the investment climate and the stability that we see in certain countries in Europe, we do expect to start growing in terms of deployment again from last year, which was about 7 gigawatts, down from over 20 in 2011. We expect to go back up to about 10 this year, though. So in that respect, we think we hit the bottom of the valley and we'll go up the other side, probably not as steeply as we had in the past, where we had a lot of deployment in 2011, 2010, but a more consistent one, whilst private financing is finding its way into our sector.
Okay. We hear a lot about governments trying to, I suppose, the energy trilemma seems to be the thing they're trying to satisfy. You sometimes think, do they need a new model? I mean, should the likes of solar power, I mean, should getting that on the grid, should that supersede? Should there be a pecking order in the trilemma? Is what I'd like to think. And I know that Europe is suffering a recession, and now we see this week with China having problems as well, that, there's a danger that, stuff that really should be, prioritized in terms of human health and planet's health, technologies, I know that everyone wants to come up with the right solution, but there's a lot of vested interest at times it's out there. And I mean, how important is it for governments to just take the lead and just that the importance of developing this technology supersedes any budgetary problems that may be out there? And, I mean, where do you sit with that?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a very good point, and actually it is a bit tricky. The trilemma does pose different problems for the policymakers. We're seeing it played out across the world today, making decisions. But I think that the way that I feel is that in Europe, we already have a law that says essentially renewables have to have priority access to the grid. So where you're producing them, they should be priority access to the grid. And I agree with that. That's actually going to drive as well the private investment we were talking about before. That's a principle that needs to be seen and needs to be maintained, because we need to go through that energy transition to create a low carbon economy. The point is, we are in an economic recession that shouldn't be at the cost of the taxpayer. And we have had a very good kickstart. As I explained, from 10 years, we've gone from 0 to what is now 3.5% of electricity final consumption in Europe at the end of last year. I mean, that might not sound like a lot, but it's huge, huge growth. And so really, the fact is that we've been given that kickstart. We can't rely on government subsidies forever. We still need to see some coming in, because I have interesting arguments and discussions with all of my friends and colleagues and all the different types of energies that there are. And the fact is that almost everybody is getting some kind of subsidy or tax cut or abatement. Everybody's getting something somewhere. So the fact is that whilst that's going on, we all need it. But I do believe, and I do believe this very seriously, that in the future, and possibly even as early in some parts of Europe by 2020 and even the world, we will be able to say that solar will be competitive without government support, without subsidy schemes. We just need to get through, I suppose it's one of the themes of what I've been telling you, we've got to get through the next few years. But actually, once we've done that, what we will be able to offer society is a CO2 free product that will produce electricity at a very competitive rate. Even today, the levelized cost of electricity of solar on large arrays is basically already competitive with things like wind, offshore wind, gas, coal, nuclear. In 5 to 10 years, that'll be even more competitive. So the point for me is that we are going to offer society a domestic supply, because you can have it and you can produce it almost anywhere. The UK was the leading installer of solar last year in Europe. And I don't know, anybody who's familiar with Britain will know that its climate's not the warmest and sunniest, though the versatility of our product actually means that it still plays an important role in the generation of electricity there. And that's actually an important thing to bring into consideration. So the way that I see it, yes, we can give you security of supply. Yes, we can certainly be economically sustainable, and we will help produce power, which is CO2 free, which of course is very important to reach the ambition of all global leaders to reduce the amount of CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere, and the amount of global warming being reduced to no more than 2 degrees centigrade. So I think we are a solution. The hand-holding will be able to stop relatively soon.
Okay. I mean, just a couple. I'm coming to the end now, but I mean, just a couple of questions. Like, why do you think solar and say wind and other renewables, that the fact that they get subsidies is so publicized, whereas other technologies, which you wouldn't, more conventional ones, don't seem to get the same?
It's our Achilles heel, if you like.
Yeah.
The public eye in an economic recession that there's been in Europe for the last, well, it feels like forever, but it's about 7 years, six years where there's been a tough economic environment. If you are really looking for to say what's bad about our products, then that's what people will pick on. To be fair, to me that's just looking at the splinter in someone else's eye rather than the log in your own.
Yeah.
In reality, and I joke with them. I'm always saying, look, there's no point in arguing about subsidies in a debate. Everybody's getting some kind of tax cut, rebate, some kind of support scheme somewhere from somebody.
But why is that so ingrained in society that that they can't stand on their own 2 feet, or that they're getting subsidies? Whereas it seems to be lost on people that the other technologies are also getting subsidies.
Because it's the only negative messaging that exists about our product.
Right. Okay. So they really drive it home. Okay.
Exactly. If they had lots of different things, then that would be, it would be somehow diffused, somehow diluted. That's the only real negative message you've got, especially with solar. And I'm not going to bash on wind. They've got their own troubles with onshore and things that go on in places like the UK, my home country. But in reality, solar doesn't have a negative popular aspect. So really, if you have to try and knock it, then you've got to find, what's your best argument? And that's to say, okay, they're only doing well because they had all those subsidies from the Renewable Energies Directive, which made governments put money in them. And really, it's just it's smoke. It's smoke. It really is. It's like trying to find the weakness of your competitor.
Right.
And I understand that, but I don't really, as I say to you, I don't really engage in it. The negative aspect of saying your product's bad, our energy is the best. The point is, we all play a role, and frankly, we're all getting our own special way of being subsidized and brought to fruition for the people. And partly that's to make sure that what we do give to society is economically viable. Energy prices aren't too high so that everybody can heat their homes.
Yeah. I mean, critics might also point out that solar has a storage problem in that it is maybe not where it could be. I mean, how valid is that argument? I mean, has storage improved much over the last few years? I know you've touched on this already early in the conversation.
Well, I'll start again on the beginning of that. And what I like to think of as solar is that it's predictable. It's a predictable energy source, not intermittent as it's been called in the past. And that I make the flippant joke of saying we know when the sun comes up and we know when it's set. We know when we're producing. But more seriously, we also know when the weather. We have good forecasting these days, so we can pretty much say we know what an array is going to produce on a given day, a few days in advance. It's getting better, so it'll be up to a week. Now, we know when we're producing power. Now the question is what is happening when you're not producing power, and also what happens with the power that you produce at any given time that isn't actually needed. And that's where storage really does come in. And storage is a really important part of the story for us for the future. Now, storage at the moment, it hasn't been seen widely. It's still a relatively expensive technology, as you'll be very, very aware. The fact is, though, like all technology, is coming down the learning curve. And right now, they are in a situation where you're seeing more governments looking at potential ways of encouraging storage. So various types of support schemes that are being put in place, existing in Germany, Austria, and other countries. And I would say that there are two points about that. And we got going because we were given the policy support to do so, but we kind of did it on our own, if you like. With storage, there's two technologies that are quite large and quite important players in the electricity system, wind and solar, that require storage. It will help pull the cost down, because as we get more and more deployment of wind and solar, we're going to need storage. And that means that we've actually, beyond the support from policymakers, there's two massive technologies crying out for this. So I think the private investment will go into it. And I think that in that respect, you'll see solar and wind will actually have come down their learning curves pretty rapidly. I think storage will come down much faster than what other people have been suggesting. And I think we'll see competitive storage probably in the next five years, basically. This is the phenomenon of having technologies that pull you down the learning curve, that can drive private money into you, as well as having the policymakers supporting you. So yes, storage is still at a fledgling level at the moment, but not for long. Just to say, not to actually overpromote it, but I went to the Intersolar exhibition this year. They had a hall full of storage, all companies from all over the world. And this really is kind of like the future of where solar will be going. Solar plus storage is going to be a major energy solution.
Okay. I'm just conscious of the fact that I keep dropping out here, so I'm getting, just for a few minutes there, I got snippets of your response. So I'm sorry about that. I would, if you have already covered this in what you just said, just wondering about hybrids as well. Is there much? There seems to be a lot more work in that sphere. Is that something where there's more development? Is it something that solar is happy about?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. It makes a lot of sense, actually. Especially, I think it was you that mentioned it earlier. Actually, it wasn't me. You're talking about Africa as well, and you've got a lot of diesel generators. There's a lot of off grid. In fact, it's going to make a lot of sense to have hybrid solutions going out into places like Africa and being installed. And I think that the way that I will see that is that yes, this will be another technology that will grow. The next level will be, though, to work with some of the energy providers that actually exist in Europe as well, whereby they can have a kind of backup storage system. And I think that what we'll see is companies like Wärtsilä, who are really very good at developing this kind of product, this hybrid product, will really take a lead to make sure that we can go through the energy transition using the lowest carbon fossil fuels alongside solar, that will really help to create that kind of transition towards more solar, more wind being used. So yes, I see hybrids as an important part of the story at the moment.
Yeah, it's a happy sort of transition phase for everyone, really, if solar and fossil fuels can work together before solar's, if you're being idealist or utopic about it, eventually takes over altogether. I just wanted to conclude by asking, is there much of a strategy for the SolarPower Europe in terms of COP21 in Paris? Is there conversations you're having in advance to get a message out there, that you're helping to develop a message that the world's governments can take notice of in November?
Yes, indeed. At the moment, we're working very heavily, and let's be honest, we're not doing this on our own. We're working with all of the other solar associations, so SEIA from the United States, the Chinese one, the Asian one. What we want to do is put out a common statement from the major solar associations in the world, and actually put forward at COP21 our vision as to why solar itself should be recognized as an important part of the COP21 discussions, should be given special mention, if you like. We definitely want to see some kind of legally binding commitment come out of that, and we want to see the right place for the, I like to think of the technologies of now and the future. It's not about protecting the past, and it's not about making sure that the policies somehow deal more favorably to technologies that I think are being phased out over time. What we need the global leaders to do is really show their commitment to technologies like solar, give us the legally binding agreement, give us special mention, and really start driving forward a world in which solar is enabled rather than hampered.
Yeah. I mean, how optimistic are you that, I mean, obviously,
Yeah,
there
yeah,
seems to be a lot of governments who haven't quite made their commitment yet. I mean, and as Caneta said there earlier this week, the time is running out. I mean, you know, I suppose that's the good thing about having a deadline. It's that it's forcing people to act quickly and just come up with good strategies. I mean, in comparison to other agreements, I mean, are you optimistic?
yeah. More optimistic about this than any of the previous ones that have gone ahead. And we saw Copenhagen really sort of go down the pan, basically. No, I think that there's reason for optimistic, but we need to be cautious. It's cautious optimism. We may not get everything that I just mentioned. We may not get the full legally binding reduction targets. That's something we just have to try and live with. But we expect there to be some kind of agreement on what action needs to be taken. So we would see that as a win still. And I think that's completely within reach. I really do think that. So yeah, we may not get our cake with a cherry on top, but I think we'll certainly get a cake.
Okay. Well, on that note, James Watson from SolarPower Europe, thank you very much. If you want to find out more in more depth or more detail about the contribution solar power is making to the overall power generation scene, you could do worse than contact James or contact his colleagues at SolarPower Europe. And if you'd like to watch this video again, this Google Hangout, you can find it on Power Engineering International website and LinkedIn. James, thank you very much again. And
Thanks, Diarmaid. It's good talking to you.
talk to you. Okay, bye.
Bye. Bye.